Good evening and welcome back to the Gospel of Matthew. Tonight we're going to focus on the Sermon of the Mount, which is found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, 6, and 7. Tonight's video lecture won't be as long as last week's, but there's going to be quite a few exercises that I'll ask you to do tonight that will prepare you for Thursday's essay that'll be due by 7:50. Here's a picture of the Colosseum in Rome. Hopefully you've been reading through Warren Carter's book, Matthew and Empire. The Colosseum would have been in place by the time the Gospel of Matthew was written in 80 to 90 of the Common Era, so this would have been a common scene in Rome during the time of Matthew. The Sermon on the Mount is important in the Gospel of Matthew for several reasons. But tonight we'll read through it and pay close attention to the use of the Q source in the Gospel of Matthew. If you remember, I talked about how the Q source was influential on Matthew as one of his sources when he wrote his Gospel. The Gospel of Matthew had both a copy of the Gospel of Mark and a copy of the Q source in front of him when he wrote that Gospel. The Sermon on the Mount is one of the most obvious cases where Matthew used the Q source, because here he agrees with Luke on a lot of those sections throughout those 3 chapters, and Mark really is non-existent. So in these instances, we believe that Matthew and Luke are using the common source, which we call the Q source. So we'll spend some time on that this evening, and I've uploaded a resource on e-learning site called not the Gospel of Matthew, but called the Sermon on the Mount. So you'll be opening that up later in this video lecture and looking through it to see how Matthew and Luke use that source material differently. After that, we'll pay close attention to the Roman political ramifications of this sermon. And there you will, I'll direct you to the Warren Carter's book, Matthew and Empire, so that you can read at least 3 pages directly from that book regarding Roman practices and how the Gospel of Matthew was written with an intent to correct some of the Roman political oppression. Then we'll turn to Jewish social ramifications from Matthew 5 through 7. And ask several questions about how the writer of this gospel interacted with other Jews, specifically in Antioch and beyond. But first, let's look at the use of the Q source in the Sermon on the Mount. Before we even have to get into the Sermon on the Mount, I want you to look at this first bullet point. The Sermon on the Mount is the first of 5 major discourses or sermons by Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. This fundamentally sets Matthew apart from the Gospel of Mark. In the Gospel of Mark, we find a lot of stories about Jesus healing and doing miracles, but there's never an extended teaching of Jesus. Mark says that Jesus teaches, but he never outlines any of those sermons. This is significant because in the Gospel of Matthew, we get Jesus' first sermon, and it's one of 5 that really are used to separate different sections of the Gospel of Matthew. The whole Gospel falls along these 5 sermons and creates 5 major divisions within the larger letter. And the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5 through chapter 7, is the first of those sermons, and we call this the Sermon on the Mount. For the other sermon you'll see is chapter 10, 5 through 42, chapter 13, 1 through 52, chapter 18, verses 1 through 35, and finally, which creates a bookend to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, 3 through 25, 46. This last sermon it ends the series of sermons by Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, but it's also the longest outside of the Sermon on the Mount. So all the sermons Jesus begins his teaching ministry in the Gospel of Matthew with the longest sermon and ends with the second longest sermon, and it has three other sermons intermittently provided through the narrative of the Gospel of Matthew. Those five sermons are going to be significant to understanding who Jesus is throughout the Gospel of Matthew. But let's turn specifically to the text itself. Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 2 is a very common passage. Many people may already know. This is better known as the Beatitudes because from verse 3 through verse 11, there's a series of passages that say, "Blessed are," starting with verse 3, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, this is where you would be served well to go to our e-learning site and look at the resource that I put on there that's entitled Sermon on the Mount Text. Now, what I have there is Matthew and Luke. It's actually all four Gospels laid out side by side, and it follows uh, the verses of Matthew. So everywhere uh, Matthew is written there, it'll have in a column right beside it the Gospel of Luke, where Luke agrees. And so you'll be able to see where Matthew and Luke agree verbatim with each other, or very close to verbatim. And this is important because in verse 3, chapter 5, verse 3, it equates to chapter 6, verse 17. And there are some striking similarities there because Luke also has these Beatitudes. Now, what I want you to do is go to that source, that file that I uploaded. You can either open it up on your computer, print it out, whichever works best for you, and underline where Matthew and Luke are in agreement with each other, where they say the same thing, and then circle where they are different. And then you'll be able to see how similar and how different Luke and Matthew are. But this material is only in Matthew and Luke. It's not in Mark at all, and certainly not in the Gospel of John. So where these two have similar material, this is where scholars believe that they are both using the Q source. So you'll be able to understand what the Q source is. Now, what's significant about where Matthew and Luke agree, it's usually around these large sections of teaching, which is why we believe that the Q source is a source of sayings or a source of sermons by Jesus. So what Matthew and Luke do is they use the Q source to gather information about what Jesus actually taught and said. And then they use the Gospel of Mark as a source for what Jesus did. So Mark is a series of stories about what Jesus did, these miracle stories. The Q source is probably a sayings source, or a source full of Jesus' sayings that Matthew and Luke use in order to expand and grow into these sermons that Jesus preaches in Matthew and Luke. In just a few minutes, I'll show you passages from another saying source that we have from the first century called the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is nothing but a series of sayings of Jesus. It's very important to modern scholarship because we believe that the Q source is something like a Gospel of Thomas, that maybe instead of just have short sayings of Jesus, it has extended teachings of Jesus. And that's what we believe that Matthew and Luke used to write their Gospels. So read these Beatitudes both in Matthew and in Luke. Compare them, see where they're the same, and see where they're different. Significantly, in the first Beatitude in Matthew says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." That's different than Luke, because Luke says, "Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." No, well, it's actually, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven." So there's two differences between Matthew and Luke where they're using the same source. They both have "blessed" as the beginning. Matthew says, "are the poor in spirit." So Matthew's talking about the poor, but it's not just economic poor here. In spirit suggests that it's not only economic impoverishment, but something beyond that, spiritual impoverishment. Um, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is very important. We'll talk about that in a little bit based on Roman social norms. But for now, just notice that Matthew's talking about the poor and he has in spirit. Luke is fundamentally different. Luke says, "Blessed are you who are poor." So Luke makes it look like Jesus is speaking directly to poor people, and rather having in spirit, Luke leaves it there. You who are poor. Period. So the poor in Luke are not spiritually poor, but actual poor, and it looks like Luke has Jesus speaking directly to them. Those are two very different understandings of what Jesus is doing, but which reflect Matthew and Luke and how each of them are using a source. The other thing that's very different is if you look in Matthew chapter 5, verse 1, it says, "When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain." So we call this the Sermon on the Mount. In Luke, it looks like Jesus is in a valley of some sort and speaking up to the crowd who are sitting on a hillside. So it's two very different things in that regard, but it's the same sermon in Luke and Matthew. Matthew, however, has Jesus on a mountain, almost like Moses, which is important for the Jewish ramifications of this text. Matthew has him sitting down, looking up. So this is important as a distinction between Matthew and Luke. It's interesting how Matthew weaves this section of salt and light into the Sermon on the Mount, and you can tell here how Matthew is using here is probably using Mark, and Luke is also using Mark, but you'll see that Luke is in a very different place here in chapter 14 and chapter 8 and chapter 11, where Luke makes reference to Mark, and Matthew uses all of it right here in chapter 5, 13 through 16. So here you see them putting their sources together as they write their Gospels. But the Salt and Light passage is worth reading. Again, this is in the literature that I gave you so that you can look over it and see how Matthew, Mark, and Luke use this passage right beside each other in the Sermon on the Mount text that is a PDF file on e-learning. This next section, so this is exactly how the Gospel of Matthew starts. 5, 1 through 12, you have the Beatitudes. Verses 13 through 16, you have the salt and light. And then 17 through 20 is very important for the Gospel of Matthew in general, not just the Sermon on the Mount. And this is where Jesus talks about the law and the prophets. We've already been talking about how Matthew is negotiating this process of incorporating Gentiles into what is a Jewish movement. This Jewish movement, however, is different than the rest of Judaism because it believes that Jesus is the Messiah of God. So there was this huge debate in early Christianity about how Gentiles are included into the Jesus movement and whether or not they have to live by the law of Moses. And then the next question was, if the Gentiles don't have to live by the law of Moses, then do the Jews who are in the Jesus movement live by the law of Moses? So Matthew's writing his gospel trying to address those issues. And here in Matthew 5, 17 through 20, this is exactly where Matthew has Jesus addressing his issues for him. That passage says, and this is Jesus preaching, right? "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teach others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven." Again, that kingdom of heaven idea comes up. "But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." So here we get Matthew's conception of how important the law is. And it's important to notice that he says law and prophets. In other words, Matthew's saying all of the scriptures that the religious community has on hand is important. And to break a single one of them is to break all of them. He has Jesus say this almost at the very beginning of his first sermon in the Gospel of Matthew. So now we know exactly where how Matthew understands the law and the prophets of ancient Judaism. These things are important and are unbreakable. You can't break one of them, or you can't be a follower of Jesus. So it's a strict conception of law uh, from Matthew's standpoint. And you can imagine how significant this would be in a place like Antioch, where we know from Paul's writings there's already been a huge split over how to interpret ancient scripture for its modern day regarding Gentiles and how they are included into the covenant. So here we have Matthew being really having a rigorous view, a conservative view of the law and scriptures. But read that passage in Matthew and then again look at Luke 16:17. This should already be in parallel for you on the PDF that I gave. So here you get um, this is how the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount begins. After he gives this statement about the law, he has Jesus go into the sermon in um, in earnest. So there you get verse 21 through 26. Jesus is teaching on anger. And then in later on in 38 through 42, you get Jesus is teaching on retaliation. And then 43 through 48, Jesus is teaching on enemies. And here it's very important because there's a formula that Matthew has Jesus say. And this formula is unique to Matthew. Luke does not have this formula like Matthew has it. And Matthew has Jesus say this formula: You have heard, dot, 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 but I say, dot, dot, dot. In every case, throughout the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew has Jesus say, You have heard that it has been said. In other words, you know what the Jewish tradition is. But I say to you, and when Matthew has Jesus say, But I say to you, Jesus always takes a rigorous stand on the law that he's taught or custom that he's talking about. So it says, You have heard that it's been said, do not sin in your anger. I tell you, don't even be angry. So it is a heightening of the law rather than a relaxation of the law. In other words, Matthew's Jesus doesn't let people off the hook. Not only is the law important, but according to Jesus' teaching, if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, you have to even be more strenuous than the law. And this is a common theme throughout the Gospel of Matthew in relation to anger, retaliation, enemies, and so forth. There's never a place where in the gospel, in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "Oh, you don't have to worry about that law; it's not that important." In the Gospel of Matthew, right here in the Sermon on the Mount, the first teachings of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, you have a more rigorous view of the law. You know what the law says, but I'm telling you, you have to live in such a way that it's more strict than that, so that you don't ever break the law. This is not unique to Jesus. This kind of rigorous understanding of the law became part and parcel of rabbinic Judaism. They came up with the idea of the Mishnah, which is basically building a hedge around the law, which is a layer of laws outside of the law, so that if you never broke the Mishnah laws, you would certainly never break the Torah law. And that's what Jesus is doing here. This is midrash on the Jewish scriptures and Jewish custom. And Jesus says, the custom says one thing, but I'm telling you, if you follow me and don't break the laws that I'm telling you, you won't ever get a chance to break the laws of Judaism. So it's a heightening of the law rather than a relaxation of the law, which would certainly put the Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew and certainly put Matthew's community in tension with Paul's community that basically is a very law lax mentality where Gentiles don't have to follow all the law to be included into the covenant. So you certainly get one set of negotiations in relation to the law that within the Jesus community in Antioch. And here in chapter 6, Jesus, the sermon continues. And here's some sections from the Gospel of Thomas, verse 6 and 14, to give you an idea of a saying source. Now, I'll go ahead and read to you Matthew 6, 1 through 4, so that you can hear what the passage is. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, 1 through 4, the central passage to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Beware of practicing your piety before others in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. So, whenever you give alms or give charity, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." So this is a passage, these are two passages from the Gospel of Thomas. His disciples asked him and said, "Do you want us to fast?" Now, this is when you stop eating or drinking, uh, revolving around prayer. "How should we pray? Should we give to charity or alms? What diet should we observe?" So, here in the Gospel of Thomas, you have the disciples asking Jesus about all this, what they should and shouldn't do related to food, related to almsgiving, related to prayer, and related to fasting. Now, these are all Jewish customs which Matthew would have taken for granted, and so would his audience. So in number 14 of the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus said to them, "If you fast, you will bring sin upon yourselves. And if you pray, you will be condemned. And if you give to charity, you will harm your spirits." So it's a real interesting thing. It's certainly not what we'd find or expect to find in the New Testament, or would even be used to in the New Testament. But this gives you an idea of the saying source. And it's not totally off base. These are things that we find right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' first sermon in the Gospel of Matthew. So these issues, the idea of charity or alms, prayer, fasting, um, and food, this is a common issue in early Christianity, and they're trying to figure it out. And so the Gospel of Thomas is there just to show you what a saying source might look like, and another source beyond the New Testament that shows us that this is some of the main issues that early Christians are dealing with. Their prayer, fasting, money are all part of the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 6, 5, and following. This is the Lord's Prayer in the Gospel of Matthew. You'll see it also in Luke 11, 2 through 4. There's some significant differences between the two, which is why you should read them together. But here in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, you get almsgiving, you get prayer, just like you have here in the Gospel of Thomas. You have fasting, just like the Gospel of Thomas, and then you have money, charity, right here. So all these things are important in early Christianity, and Matthew has Jesus systematically dealing with each one of these in ways that kind of codify for Matthew not just what Jesus said, but how the followers of Jesus should live in Matthew's own time towards the end of the first century. So look at these. Fasting is unique to Matthew. Prayer, this Lord's Prayer, is something that you can read alongside Luke. Matthew 1, 6, 1 through 4, its only real parallels might be found here in the Gospel of Thomas, but probably not. Just gives passages of the similar theme. And then chapter 6, 24 through 34, that deals specifically with money, and ends chapter 6. There you'll find Luke, and you see how Luke uses the same material all over his gospel in different places. This is because Luke is using a similar source, but at different times and in different ways. Luke actually has a lot more to say about money than Matthew does, but it's really important to read Matthew 6:24 through 34 to see exactly how Matthew understands the way Jesus followers are supposed to understand money and possessions, which isn't a small theme in Matthew because it takes up such a large section, 10 verses, in fact, of the Sermon on the Mount. But it's important to read the way Matthew understands possessions and the way Luke understands possessions because they're using similar sources, but in just different ways. So I hope you can see from these sections that I've highlighted how Matthew and Luke are using the similar source, the Q source in particular, in different ways. But I also hope to see that you're understanding a little bit more about the Gospel of Matthew, specifically that author's understanding of how his own people, the people who are going to be reading his gospel, understand law and their allegiance to the law, which is Jewish law, Jewish custom, and how that's an integral part of their faith in Jesus. So let's go now to the Roman political ramifications. The love your enemies passage, which is almost famous, well, it is famous, if not infamous, in the Gospel of Matthew, is important because if it's written in Antioch after the destruction of the temples, the soldiers who destroyed Judea and Jerusalem and the temple would have most likely moved back to Antioch. So the Jewish people who during the war probably ran away from the war and ended up in Antioch. You have people who basically war immigrants in Antioch who were living in the same place as the soldiers who destroyed Jerusalem and Judea and the temple. And they're living right beside each other now. And Matthew is right in the middle of that. So Matthew is negotiating a heated, deep-seated hurt between Jews in Antioch and Roman soldiers in particular, who live right beside each other. And not only is he negotiating a Jewish-Gentile tension, he's negotiating a tension within Judaism itself between followers of Jesus and those who do not think Jesus is the Messiah. So Matthew has at least two fronts, the Roman and Gentile front and the Jewish front that doesn't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So when he gets to this passage, this in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus says, "Love your enemies," as a way to make the law more rigorous, that would have been said right in the middle of a city that had deep-seated enemies. So the Romans and the Gentiles would have absolutely been seen as enemies in Antioch, specifically the Roman soldiers who would walk around in Antioch in their uniforms. They were absolutely the enemies. This is only a decade or two after the destruction of Jerusalem. So they would have seen their enemies walking through the streets, possibly people who had killed their family members. That is not an exaggeration because these cities weren't huge, and it's quite likely that would have happened. So when Jesus tells the crowd to love your enemies, this would have been very hard teaching in Antioch. Um, for Jewish believers in Jesus, even they would have had a hard time hearing this because it would have meant that they would have to look to these Roman soldiers with forgiveness in their beings. So this it begins this way where you're supposed to extend this kind of selfless generosity and love to your enemies. But it's not just a total acceptance. It's important to know that Jesus certainly calls for his followers to love their enemies. But it's also important to notice this empire of heaven that Matthew talks about in chapter 5:3. Uh, yours will be the kingdom of heaven, chapter 5:10, chapter 5:19, chapter 6:10, chapter 6:19 through 20. The empire of heaven or the kingdom of heaven is a common theme throughout the Sermon on the Mount, and it's also a theme throughout the Gospel of Matthew. And that empire, that kingdom of heaven, you can absolutely translate it as empire of heaven because the Greek word is the exact same word. And any Romans who would have gotten wind of this would have absolutely understood Matthew's conception of the empire of heaven as a rival empire. So Matthew completely understands the Roman Empire as corrupt and evil, but corrupt and evil that needs to be redeemed. And for Matthew, this love your enemies is extending your love to your enemies, but understand that your enemies are evil. The Roman Empire is absolutely corrupt and evil, according to Matthew, and even according to the Jesus of Matthew. And so this anti-imperial or anti-Roman sentiment runs throughout Matthew, and he fluctuates between condemning Roman oppression and extending God's love to them as a way to convert them from that kind of oppression. And here's where I want you to read Warren Carter's work, Matthew and Empire, pages specifically pages 70 through 73 on social well-being. There you'll hear Carter described how the Roman Empire understood itself as the entity that held everything together. For social betterment and social well being, everybody depended on the benevolence of the Roman Empire. Well, that certainly is being co opted in the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew did not think there was social well being within the Roman Empire. He absolutely thought that it was social destruction in the empire. And he understood that the empire of God, or the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, was the real place to go for social well being. And so it absolutely sets up rival kingdoms. So that's the Roman political ramifications in the Sermon on the Mount. Whenever you read kingdom, kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God, anything related to kingdom and king in the Gospel of Matthew, that's generally where Matthew really is speaking against Rome. So you at least see two different things in the Sermon on the Mount. You have this love your enemies while at the same time condemning evil, and Matthew holds those things in tension. This is our last slide for the lecture. It deals with the Jewish social ramifications. Uh, Throughout the Gospel of Matthew, he never says that Jesus is the new Moses, but from beginning to end, that's how Matthew portrays Jesus. From his very birth, it says that Jesus had to go to Egypt, and so you have a Jesus coming up out of Egypt like Moses. At Jesus' birth, there's an attempt to destroy all the babies on Herod's part. This is very similar to the Pharaoh killing all the children during Moses' birth. So both have an infanticide moment when they were children. Both come out of Egypt. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus goes up to the top of the mountain, and there he basically gives a new law to the people. You have heard that the law said this. Well, I'm telling you this. So he's renewing the law of Moses, and so he's a new lawgiver in that sense. Just like Moses went up to Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments from God and came down and brought it to the people, Jesus is on the mountain in the Gospel of Matthew receiving these words from God and giving it to the people. So Jesus is absolutely a new Moses throughout the narrative. He's the new giver of the law, like I just said, with the Sermon on the Mount. And what does Jesus do to the law? Well, I've already said this, right? Jesus makes the law even more strict, even more rigorous. So you'll hear this trope throughout the Sermon on the Mount about hypocrites. So who are the hypocrites, and what are their social significance for the Matthean community? Hypocrites are the other Jews, really. So Matthew absolutely is a Jew. He understands Jesus as a Jew, but he also understands that Jesus has a lot of Jewish opponents. So these opponents, not just of Jesus, but the opponents of Matthew's community within Judaism in Antioch, he absolutely has them in mind when he's talking about the hypocrites. These are the ones who say they have the law but don't follow it. These are the ones who say they believe in God but don't believe in Jesus. So these are this is the Jewish community that has ostracized Matthew and Matthew's community because of their belief in Jesus. So here you have Matthew saying that Jesus is the new Moses, he's the new lawgiver. He makes the law even more rigorous, and those who can't see that are all hypocrites. So it's a clear distinction within the Gospel of Matthew, right here in the Sermon on the Mount, that Matthew's drawn a line between the Jewish Jesus movement in Antioch and the Jewish community outside of that, as well as a line between Gentiles and Jesus believing Jews. Although he certainly makes it possible for those Gentiles to enter into the covenant with the Jesus movement. This is how the Sermon on the Mount plays out. You can see from beginning to end what Matthew's doing here, and it sets up a Jesus that allows Gentiles to come in, but certainly holds on to the law and the prophets from beginning to end. That's it for tonight. Pay real close attention to those the PDF files that I put on our e-learning site. Read those together, and you'll be able to see how Matthew and Luke are using similar sources. This will absolutely prepare you for your essay that's due this coming Thursday at 7:50. All the best.